So detailing the eye isn't too difficult. It's just time consuming because you're basically going over it and just changing colors, refining it, because you're trying to get that sense of light and dark and depth, and you're trying to create the illusion of certain things. We have a little bit of depth from the contouring. We may want a little more. You could even add a displacement map later once you have everything worked out with your colors, and that's fairly simple to create as well later. For now, let's talk about refining the eye appearance a little bit here. Now, while I was working, I applied a shade auto smooth. Now, by default, it sets it around 30 degrees on that. Usually I'll go in and I'll try ignore angle because we've got this little sharp edge here that I don't really want. And even if I subdivide it sometimes, and if I still keep this smoothing on there, I'll increase the angle so that it'll definitely get rid of some of those sharp edges. Now, as I increase it, you see the sharp edges go away and it looks a bit more smooth. So I'm going to leave this at around, let's say, 45. And that should be fine, just to make sure nothing pops up later. Okay, and as you can see, I've already done a little bit of tweaking here to try to clean things up here. I've got it this red color. So I'll stick with that red color for now, and let's do a little something different with the overall color of our iris. So I'm going down to the iris color, and I'm going to tweak this a little bit and make the sort of the center a little narrower. And then we can start adding in additional tabs here to modify the color. So all you have to do is hit plus, and it'll add another color in there. And then you can just adjust the color. Just click on the color tab and start choosing. Let's see. I've done a green eye. Let's try we'll try another blue eye maybe. So in the center, I'm going to make my saturation pretty much 100%. Okay. But then I'm going to make it a little darker. So I'm going to decrease the value, make this my darkest area. Okay, and then I'm going to, with that same one selected, and create a new one. And it always creates the newest one, sort of floating in between itself and the neck and the previous one. So just keep that in mind when we're working. And I'm going to go along the same shading, just another hue of blue, but a bit lighter. Okay, so as you can see, if I go beyond, it sort of flips, and now the white's on the wrong side. But that's okay. You can just pull that out. And just like the mask, this tab here is going to control how far our iris actually goes. I want it to stay somewhere around 0.8 when it comes to position. Okay, because that's where I sculpted it to. So that's where I end it. If you didn't sculpt it and you're just going with the general sphere, you can just, do whatever. Again, it just depends on what you're going for. And so this looks pretty good when it comes to the color. And you could add more colors in here to create additional visual effects like a highlight or a deeper shadow or things like that. You can just play around with it and see what you like. Okay. So in some of these others, I have at least 4, maybe 5 different colors down here on the iris color. So it just depends on what you're going for. So now as for the additional detail, now right now we don't really see much of the noise at all. So let's go over and take a look at our settings. So first of all, with our node texture, I usually set that as 2D. And just like the wave, the scale is going to determine how much of the noise we start to see. Now, as you can see, if you look close, you can see the noise is in there. It's just that it was just sort of a one large piece of a couple note pixels of noise instead of a bunch. So increasing the scale increases the amount of noise that's in there. And we can also play around with a couple of different settings in here to make it a little clearer and a little easier to see. But first we need to switch it to, let's say, rigid multifractal. Now we actually start to get to see more in the eye. And that's usually where I go with that setting. I'll go to multifractal so I can get this really psychedelic sort of look in the background here. And if you increase the scale, it basically increases the amount of noise. And so it becomes like flecks in the eye. And then you have other settings you can play around with, like offset, where you can actually increase the clarity or the blending of the wave with the noise. It's actually very nice. So we can actually actively use this to modify the eye, even when animating. Playing around with the gain, and some of this stuff is going to sort of blur the edges a little bit. So you can also, again, get a different level of detail. Now, if I decrease the noise a little bit here, if I want it to be more subtle, I could just have it give slight color variations in the eye instead of an overall effect. So it just depends on what you're going for. And of course, if you decrease or increase the number of waves, that also changes what you're getting. You can also add some distortion on there to make it look a bit more organic. Okay, which also adds to it looking more like an actual eye. And you can play with this for a very long time. And as you can see, this being red really doesn't have too much influence at this level. If we push it out, then you can really see what our noise and our waves look like. But when they're blended with our blue, you don't see much. So you could play around with the colors there and see what else you can get. And just play with it until you like it. I'm going to move this aside so I can see. And as you can see, most of these colors aren't going to do much, but you can see some where it starts to cause things to lighten up a bit or get darker. So you can just play with it and see what's going to enhance and what's not. And of course, you can add additional colors in to essentially change the depth or to aid in the changing of the depth. They can make it an area darker depending on which color it is, and of course the saturation on that color. But generally I try to be consistent with the hue that I'm using. So if I was going to stick with this more pink purple color, then I'd also go to a similar hue for my first tab. So I get rid of that one, maybe add another tab with a similar color, and then fool around with the saturation. And generally, if you're trying to keep it a little bit darker, you can increase the saturation, and that usually gets the job done. Since this is sort of being multiplied and added to our colors, it helps to sort of enhance it. And this is where you can actually go in and start playing around with the different blend settings of your nodes. And don't forget, this is a mask, so we can use that to pull back on our organic element to give us more of a hard edge there to really define the edge of our eye. And so if you like your iris the way it is, you can stick with that. You can also play around with the connections a little bit. Instead of feeding out color, for example, from the noise, you could feed in just the fact value, which then will give you it'll give you sort of the texture, the visual texture, without the color change that you usually get from the noise color. As you can see, there is a hue change there. And that's because it's feeding out lots and lots of color. And of course, you can change the factor value on the multiply, and that also influences how much of your noise comes through, how little. Again, just different ways to affect the detailing. Like I said, you can play around with it and see which one you like better. But I've generally found that multiply works rather well, as you can see in some of these other examples. And see, this is where you can really see the color coming through in this green eye, and that's from noise. In addition to focusing on the iris, you can also add a little detail in to change the color of the eye in the back there. And that's as simple as going in to the color. And let's say we'll go to the first one here. And we'll add an extra one there. And we'll take this one, we'll pull this one all the way back here. Actually, did I grab the right one? I think I did. And we'll make this red. And that way we can get sort of that fleshy transition. If you really need something like that, you can do that. And again, we can do the same thing to our mask, because our mask is actually a combination of multiplying the white and our colors. And so we can do sort of the same thing there to just sort of get the hint of our veins. But then I'd probably add an additional one to really control where the white part of our mask begins and where it ends. This way you can come in and pull that in, limit the effect on the iris, but also reduce the effect on the overall eye itself. So we can have just the hint of the pink in the eye. We can leave it coming all the way up like this, or we could add yet another flag in here. Decrease all saturation so it's white, and then we can really control how far that pink bleeds into the rest of the eye. Okay, and you can also pull this one out to increase the density, but as you can see, you start to see some of the noise from our noise texture. If you want to get rid of that noise, you'd have to, of course, go in, instead of feeding the color into it, you'd feed just in the FAC, and that way it would just be essentially a black and white value with that in, so you wouldn't see these discoloration. But I kind of really like the discoloration a little. It almost looks like it's a little bruised. But essentially, that's our setup for procedural eye. The rest comes down to adding additional elements to help detail and refine. And of course, playing around with your settings to increase density, noise, sharpness, and so on. So after tweaking things a little bit, I got something that I kind of like. Okay. And just so you know, with the wave settings, I find that the triangle and the saw value give you some very interesting visual effects there. The sine is okay, but I often switch to saw or triangle, which gives me sort of softer edges in some ways. And then when I start playing out the distortion and the offset and sometimes the detailing here, on the noise, you play around with your offset. You can either sharpen those edges or feather them out a little more, and you get some very interesting effects. Although going around negative 0.1 with your offset usually gives you a pretty solid place to start when it comes to creating the illusion of depth and creases using the wave and its transitions from wave to wave. Gives you nice wrinkles there. And if you don't want wrinkles, of course, you can decrease that like I did here. Wrinkles are very minimal, and it's mostly about the colors. Transition between the weight and the noise, which does very interesting things within the eye, depending on what sort of look you want to go for. So play around with it and see if it's something you like.